For 10 long years, the Greeks fought beneath the towering walls of Troy. Thousands died. Great kings fell. Heroes became legends. And when the city finally burned, most believed the suffering was over. For one man, it had only just begun. His name was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, master strategist, the man traditionally credited with the idea of the wooden horse that finally brought Troy to its knees. He had survived one of the greatest wars in Greek legend. He had watched friends die. He had defeated enemies who seemed impossible to overcome. Now only one journey remained. Going home. It should have taken weeks. According to the ancient Greek epic known as the Odyssey, it took 10 years. Not because the seas were long, because the gods themselves stood in his way. In Homer's telling, Odysseus left Troy with 12 ships and hundreds of loyal companions. They believed victory meant safety. Instead, every mile carried them farther from it. The first warning came almost immediately. The fleet reached the land of the Cyclones. What should have been a quick victory turned into disaster. Driven by overconfidence, Odysseus and his men lingered too long after their raid. Reinforcements arrived. The Greeks were forced back to their ships. Many never escaped. It was a painful lesson. Winning a war did not guarantee surviving the journey home. The sea itself soon became another enemy. Storms scattered the fleet across unfamiliar waters. Days blended into weeks. The stars disappeared behind endless clouds. Every island promised hope. Every coastline concealed another danger. According to the epic, Odysseus eventually reached the mysterious land of the Lotus Eaters. There, some of his companions tasted the strange lotus plant. Almost immediately, they lost all desire to continue their journey. They no longer cared about Ithaca, their families, or even who they had once been. They wanted only to remain where they were, forever. Whether Homer intended this as a literal place or a symbolic warning about temptation and forgetting one's purpose has been debated for centuries. Either way, Odysseus acted quickly. He dragged his own men back to the ships by force. If he had hesitated, the journey would have ended there. Yet even this strange encounter was only the beginning. Ahead lay an island where a single creature would forever change Odysseus' fate, a place where intelligence would triumph over strength, but at a terrible cost. The Greeks called him the Cyclops. After escaping the island of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus believed the worst was behind him. He could not have been more mistaken. According to the Odyssey, his fleet soon reached a rugged island where towering cliffs overlooked a lonely coastline. Smoke drifted into the sky from a cave high above the sea, and curious voices echoed from within. Against the advice of some of his men, Odysseus chose to investigate. It was a decision that would haunt him for the next decade. Inside the cave, they found something extraordinary. Shelves stacked with enormous wheels of cheese. Pens filled with sheep and goats, massive wooden bowls. Everything was far too large for an ordinary man. His companions urged him to take what they could and leave immediately, but Odysseus wanted to meet the cave's owner. He believed that, according to the sacred Greek tradition of Xenia, the duty of hospitality towards strangers, they might receive gifts before continuing their voyage. Instead, they met a monster. The cave's owner was Polyphemus, one of the Cyclopes, a giant of terrifying strength. As evening fell, Polyphemus returned with his flock. Without noticing the hidden Greeks, he rolled an enormous stone across the entrance of the cave. The exit vanished. Only then did he discover the strangers. Odysseus introduced himself politely, asking for the hospitality that Greek custom demanded. The Cyclops laughed. According to the epic, Polyphemus cared nothing for the laws of men, or even the authority of Zeus, protector of guests. Then, before the horrified Greeks, he seized two of Odysseus' companions. The poem describes the scene with shocking brutality. The men were killed and eaten inside the cave. The message was immediate. There would be no negotiation, no mercy. The survivors considered attacking the giant as he slept. But Odysseus realized something terrifying. Even if they killed him, none of them could move the enormous stone blocking the entrance. They would die trapped inside. So instead of relying on strength, he relied on intelligence. The next evening, Odysseus offered the Cyclops strong wine brought from Troy. Polyphemus had never tasted anything like it. He drank eagerly, again and again. Soon, the giant collapsed into a drunken sleep. Before losing consciousness, he asked one final question. "What is your name?" Odysseus smiled. "My name is Nobody." When the Cyclops fell asleep, Odysseus and his companions drove a sharpened olive wood stake into his single eye. Polyphemus awoke, screaming in agony. Other Cyclopes rushed outside the cave and shouted, "Who is hurting you?" The giant cried back, "Nobody is hurting me." Believing no attack was taking place, they left him alone. It became one of the most famous moments in Greek literature. At dawn, the blinded Cyclops rolled away the stone and felt each sheep as it left the cave, hoping to catch the escaping Greeks. But Odysseus had anticipated that as well. According to the Odyssey, each man tied himself beneath the belly of a sheep. Hidden beneath the animals, they slipped safely past the giant's searching hands. The escape was brilliant. It should have been a perfect victory. But as the ships pulled away from shore, Odysseus made one fatal mistake. His pride overcame his caution. Unable to leave anonymously, he shouted back across the sea, revealing his true name and mocking the defeated Cyclops. Polyphemus lifted his face toward the sky and called upon his father, the sea god Poseidon. He prayed that Odysseus would never return home, or, if he did, that he would arrive alone, after losing everything he loved. Whether viewed as divine punishment or a literary lesson about the dangers of pride, this moment changes the entire story. From this point onward, Odysseus is no longer simply trying to cross the sea. He is sailing beneath the anger of a god, and every island that follows will bring a new trial. After escaping the Cyclops, Odysseus believed he had outwitted fate itself. He had survived the impossible. His ships still floated. Some of his men were still alive. And Ithaca, though distant, no longer seemed unreachable. Then, according to the Odyssey, fortune offered him an unexpected gift. He arrived at the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Welcoming the weary king with generosity, Aeolus listened to the story of Troy and the horrors that had followed. Before Odysseus departed, the ruler handed him a tightly bound leather bag. Inside, he said, were all the dangerous winds that could drive the fleet off course. Only the gentle west wind remained free to carry them safely home. For 9 days and 9 nights, the voyage went perfectly. At last, the shores of Ithaca appeared on the horizon. Odysseus, exhausted after steering the ship without rest, finally closed his eyes. It was the closest he would come to home for many years. His companions looked at the mysterious leather bag. They had watched their king guard it with extraordinary care. Rumors spread among the crew. Surely it contained gold. or silver, or treasure stolen from Troy. Consumed by curiosity, and perhaps resentment, they untied the cords. Instantly, the imprisoned winds exploded across the sea. The fleet was thrown violently backward. The coastline of Ithaca disappeared into the distance. Home had slipped through their hands, not because of an enemy, but because of distrust within their own ranks. When Odysseus returned to Aeolus seeking help once more, the ruler refused. If the gods had cursed this man so completely, he believed, no mortal should interfere. Once again, the fleet sailed into uncertainty. The next land they encountered proved even worse. According to the epic, it belonged to the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals. Unlike the Cyclops, these creatures did not trap a handful of men. They attacked an entire fleet. Great stones crashed down from towering cliffs. Ships splintered. Warriors drowned beneath the waves. Those who reached shore faced enemies who hunted them like animals. By the end of the attack, nearly every Greek ship had been destroyed. Only one vessel escaped, Odysseus' own. Years of war, reduced to a single surviving ship. The few men who remained eventually reached the island of the enchantress Circe. At first, she welcomed them. Food was prepared. Wine was poured. Then the spell was cast. One by one, Odysseus' companions were transformed into swine, not because they had committed some great crime, but because they had trusted appearances. Warned by the messenger god Hermes, Odysseus received a magical herb said to protect him from Circe's enchantments. When she attempted to cast the same spell upon him, it failed. For the first time, the sorceress faced someone she could not control. According to the Odyssey, admiration replaced hostility. Circe restored the men to human form. She offered hospitality, guidance, and a terrible piece of advice. If Odysseus wished to reach home, he would first have to travel somewhere no living hero wished to go, the underworld. There, among the spirits of the dead, he would seek the prophet Tiresias. Only he could reveal the path back to Ithaca. The journey was no longer simply across the sea. It had become a journey through death itself. And beyond the land of shadows waited even greater dangers. The Sirens, Scylla, Charybdis, trials from which not every man would return. According to the Odyssey, no living man had willingly entered the land of the dead and returned. Yet that was exactly what Odysseus was now expected to do. Following Circe's instructions, his lone surviving ship sailed to the edge of the world, where the rivers of the underworld were said to meet. There, Odysseus performed the rituals described by Homer. A trench was dug, offerings were poured, and the spirits began to gather. At first they appeared only as shadows, silent, restless. Countless souls pressed toward the sacrifice, each desperate for a single taste of blood that would briefly restore memory and speech. Odysseus stood with his sword drawn, allowing only one spirit to approach, the prophet Tiresias. When Tiresias finally spoke, his message brought little comfort. The gods had not abandoned Odysseus, but neither would they make his journey easy. He warned him never to harm the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. If his men obeyed, some might yet return home. If they failed, the voyage would end in disaster. Before leaving the underworld, Odysseus encountered other spirits whose stories reflected the terrible cost of the Trojan War. He met his mother, who had died while waiting for him to return. She had not fallen in battle. She had not been struck by disease. According to the epic, she simply lost the will to live after years of believing her son would never come home. Odysseus tried 3 times to embrace her. 3 times his arms passed through empty air. For a warrior who had survived monsters and kings, this proved one of the deepest wounds of all. He also met Achilles, the greatest hero of Troy. In life, Achilles had won eternal glory. In death, Homer gives him words that have echoed through history. He declares that he would rather live as the servant of a poor farmer than rule over all the dead. It is one of the Odyssey's most powerful reflections on the true cost of fame. Armed with Tiresias' warning, Odysseus returned to Circe's island. She prepared him for the trials that still lay ahead. The first were the Sirens. Their songs promised perfect knowledge. They called to every sailor by name. According to the legend, no one who followed their voices ever returned. Odysseus wanted to hear the song without steering the ship toward destruction. Following Circe's advice, his crew sealed their ears with beeswax. Odysseus alone remained able to listen. He ordered his companions to bind him tightly to the mast. No matter what he said, no matter how desperately he begged, they were not to release him. As the ship passed the island, the Sirens began to sing. They promised wisdom beyond imagination. They claimed to know everything that had happened at Troy, everything that would happen afterward. Their voices became almost unbearable. Odysseus struggled against the ropes. He shouted commands. He pleaded for freedom. His crew ignored every word and pulled harder at the oars. Only when the voices faded into the distance did the danger finally pass. But a greater choice awaited them. Ahead stood 2 horrors from which there was no perfect escape. On one side waited Scylla, a 6-headed sea monster hidden among the cliffs. On the other churned Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool capable of swallowing an entire ship. Circe had already delivered the cruel truth. No captain could avoid both. Steer too close to Charybdis. Everyone might die. Sail nearer to Scylla. Some would certainly be lost. Odysseus made the hardest decision any leader can face. He chose the path where fewer lives would be sacrificed. As the ship slipped beneath the cliffs, Scylla struck without warning. 6 of his strongest companions were seized before anyone could react. Odysseus watched helplessly as they disappeared forever. He could defeat armies. He could outwit giants. He could survive the land of the dead. But he could not save every man who followed him. And the final tragedy was still waiting beyond the horizon. After surviving the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis, Odysseus believed the worst of his journey had finally passed. According to the Odyssey, one final warning remained. The prophet Tiresias and the enchantress Circe had both spoken of the same place, the island of the sun god Helios. Its sacred cattle were never to be harmed, no matter how desperate the crew became, no matter how hungry they were. For a time, Odysseus' men obeyed. Then the winds changed. Storms trapped the ship on the island for weeks. Food supplies disappeared. The sailors grew weaker with each passing day. When Odysseus left to pray for guidance, exhaustion overcame him and he fell asleep. His companions made a decision that would seal all their fates. Believing starvation was certain if they did nothing, they slaughtered several of Helios' sacred cattle. It was an act of desperation, but according to the epic, it was also an unforgivable violation of divine law. When Helios learned what had happened, he demanded justice from Zeus himself. The king of the gods answered. As soon as Odysseus and his crew returned to sea, the skies darkened. Thunder rolled across the horizon. Lightning split the clouds. Then Zeus struck the ship with a single devastating bolt. The vessel shattered. Masts collapsed into the sea. Waves swallowed the men one after another. After 20 years of war and wandering, Odysseus was completely alone. Every companion who had left Troy beside him was gone. Clinging to broken pieces of his ship, he drifted across the open sea for days until he reached the island of Calypso. There, according to Homer, the immortal nymph offered him something no warrior had ever been promised: safety, comfort, even immortality itself, if he remained with her. For 7 years, Odysseus lived on the island, not as a prisoner in chains, but as a man separated from everything that gave his life meaning. The gods eventually intervened. At the command of Zeus, Hermes ordered Calypso to let him go. Reluctantly, she obeyed. Odysseus built a raft with his own hands and sailed once more toward Ithaca. Even then, Poseidon had not forgiven him. One final storm nearly destroyed everything. Only with the help of the sea goddess Leucothea and the hospitality of the Phaeacians did he finally reach the shores of his homeland. 20 years had passed since he had left for Troy, but Ithaca was no longer the home he remembered. His palace had been overrun by powerful nobles who believed he was dead. These men, known as the suitors, consumed his wealth, abused his servants, and pressured his faithful wife Penelope to choose a new husband. His son, Telemachus, had grown into adulthood without truly knowing his father. Disguised as a beggar by Athena, Odysseus quietly entered his own home. No one recognized him. He watched. He listened. He measured every man who had stolen his kingdom. Then came the famous contest of the bow. Only Odysseus could string his great bow and fire an arrow cleanly through 12 axe heads. The disguised stranger stepped forward. The hall erupted with laughter. Moments later, silence. The bow bent. The arrow flew, and the king of Ithaca revealed himself at last. The battle that followed ended the suitor's occupation and restored his household. Yet victory came at a cost. Odysseus had finally reached home, but he was no longer the man who had sailed away 2 decades earlier. The Odyssey is remembered not because it tells the story of a hero who defeated monsters. It is remembered because it tells the story of a man who endured loss, temptation, grief, loneliness, and impossible choices, yet never abandoned the hope of returning home. Whether every episode reflects ancient belief, poetic symbolism, or layers of myth built over centuries, the journey of Odysseus has endured for nearly 3,000 years, not because it promises an easy path, but because it reminds us that the longest journey any person may ever take is the journey back to who they once were.